Woolworths is a combination of a food and clothing retailer. It pioneered organic food retailing in South Africa and now has very significant clothing retail interests in Australia. Market cap here of 81.9 billion rand, price to earnings ratio of 24.8 and a dividend yield of 2.7%. Chris, let's just talk about the clothing retailers in general before we dive specifically into Woolworths. Are you relatively confident that the South African consumer is going to see itself clear?
Well, it's a moving target. If you'd asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have said steer clear of clothing retailers because it's purely down to discretionary income. You asked me 3 months ago, things had changed. You'd seen a huge boon to consumer spending from the lower oil prices, and we were seeing it in the good Christmas sales, for example, much better than expected for the clothing retailers. Now, with most of that good news having been out of the equation because of Mr. Nene's budget, because of a couple of other big increases in the fuel levy, the R3.60 or thereabouts that we've had since September last year has all but been eradicated. So as a result, that very positive factor on discretionary spending has now gone out of the equation. So I think you've got to be a bit more wary of the clothing retailers. There's quite a few of them in here we're going to be discussing now, but I think you've got to be very, very selective because not all of them, particularly the ones that rely heavily on the South African economy, are going to do that well.
To what extent does Woolies rely on the South African economy? Are we not looking at a slightly more defensive stock here? Of course, it is in the portfolio and has been a long-time favourite with Paul.
I think slightly less now because of the David Jones acquisition. Obviously, they diversified a lot internationally, big exposure in Australia. We're obviously talking about the clothing side of Woolies, and I think that's where they're focusing most of their growth, not only through this acquisition of David Jones, but also their expansion throughout Africa is more focused on the clothing side. I know Ian Moore is a specialist in the clothing retail spectrum, and he also really likes the higher margins. Moving the food around and keeping it fresh, it's a very, very tough business. The clothing is a lot easier. Obviously, you've got to get your buying right and your product mix and the whole retail experience, and I think that's where Woolies really, really get it right. The whole retail experience is fantastic. You walk into a Woolworths, you feel like you've come home.
Let's look at that share price graph there, Chris. Give us a little more insight into where we could go from here.
Yeah, it just keeps on going, doesn't it? And as Byron says, look, with the acquisition of David Jones, look, they already had a big exposure in Australia with Country Road, with the Witchery and things like that. But this now takes them into different territory. This takes them into hard currency areas. Nice rand hedge. And although it's at the rarefied levels these days, I think it's still got a way to go because
would you back it for the clothing element,
definitely,
for the clothing side,
without a shadow of a doubt. As Byron said, look, I mean, maybe I'm paraphrasing here, but the food side has always been very, very good. It's only in recent years that the clothing side's really taken off because they put a lot of time and energy and effort into this whole thing, and that's paid big dividends. And particularly when it comes to the Australian side, I think that's really going to pay even bigger dividends. Yes, absolutely.
Byron, nothing to complain about as far as Chris Gilmore is concerned on Woolworths. Anything you'd like to add before we call it?
I think, the whole David Jones acquisition, the David Jones are also very much involved in food. People don't realize that. I spoke to a friend who lives in Australia and came to visit, and she said that, the food side is great as well. It's sort of a Thrups type model where you go and buy top end foods. And it's a turnaround story. And I think, what that Woolworths team has managed to do, like Chris just mentioned, at one stage the clothes were struggling. Woolworths weren't really renowned for good clothing. It was more of a grocery type business. And they turned that around. And I think, the David Jones story is certainly a turnaround story. And I think they're going to be able to implement that successfully.
Hot or not, Chris?
Hot, very hot.
Hot or not?
Well, everything I'm wearing is from Woolworths, so I'd back Woolworths.
There's your endorsement. Hot from Byron.